Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Revolution. Welcome to our show today. We're going to be talking about elections and the fight for political independence. We're going to try to hammer out a definition of what we mean by political independence. But first, we want to wish everybody a happy Labor Day on Monday. A shout out to UAW Local 2300, the facilities workers at Cornell University who are on strike right now. I believe they have a tentative agreement that they have yet to vote on, but happy Labor Day, especially to all the folks out there on the picket lines fighting for the advancement of the working class. So, elections and the fight for political independence. We hear a lot about independence, the number of independent voters, something like what, 49% of voters don't identify with either of the major political parties. And I've read some articles talking about how this could be the basis of a movement, right? All these people that don't identify with the Democrats or the Republicans, if we could just get them together, right? We could have a real right, center, left coalition that could actually get things done. Is that how we see political independence, Anita? Is in terms of like just refusal to identify with one or another of the major parties?
I don't think so. I mean, what the research shows that although people say they're independent, they end up, of course, voting for one of the major parties. And I think I mean, each state has their own rules about how to register and how to identify yourself as a party member or not. And in Ohio, there's a large number of independent voters, but that's because these are people who just don't vote in the primary. That's how you become a Republican or a Democrat in Ohio. You vote in the primary and you request that ballot. And then the next primary, you could request the other party's ballot and it would switch you back. So it's not really showing a commitment. I guess in some states you actually do register in the party name and then you can't vote in the primary for the other party. But could I also mention one thing about Labor Day today? Farm Laborers Organizing Council starts to organize temporary migrant farm workers are now allowed to unionize or not allowed. Their employers are not allowed to retaliate against unionization efforts. It's a small thing, but it's significant, and I just want to congratulate Flock, Farm Labor Organizing Collective, for that.
Hell yeah, that's not a small thing at all. That's wonderful, and could be a huge step forward for one of the most exploited and oppressed sections of our class. And we know as communists that when we lift up that bottom, it lifts everybody up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a huge deal. And returning to our topic of political independence, Bennett, is there? And it seems like there's often an attempt by pundits to inject some kind of ideological content into this mass of independent voters, like they're centrists as opposed to extremists, for example. Is that really what's going on, or?
I mean, I don't think so. I think that, you know, the people that don't vote, which oftentimes is with the exception of like 2020, is often a majority of the country, or, people who are not registered with either party. I think that there's a just general kind of dissatisfaction with American politics and seeing the ways in which these two parties don't necessarily represent them. But that doesn't mean that they represent a kind of extremist view in one way or another. Um, I think though that kind of illustrates that if we're thinking about alternatives to the two-party system, we also have to think about how these independent voters or these non-voters are still kind of wedded to that system by not kind of investing in like alternatives that exist. So I think that we have to think about how as communists we can present an alternative plan, an alternative kind of struggle against capitalism and against kind of the business as usual politics.
Exactly, and you raise a very good point that a lot of this is reflective of dissatisfaction with the two major parties and their control of things. We in the party often talk about not the number of independent or nonpartisan voters, but the forces of political independence. Is that could you give us an example, maybe, Bennett, of what some of those forces might be?
I mean, there's a number of those kinds of forces. I mean, when you think about mass movements, these are um, movements that exist with both participants that are in the two major parties, but also in a lot of people who are not politically engaged in mainstream politics outside of these kinds of movements or struggles. And so I think that those forces really represent kind of the kernel of independence, and they represent independent political actors. And I think that there's a lot of examples that we could point to, like the union movement, um, mass struggles like Black Lives Matter in 2020 and onwards. I think that those movements kind of represent a political independence of sorts, in themselves.
Thank you. And turning to CJ, you're obviously an activist, a participant in some of these mass movements, but also you cover them for the people's world. So from your perspective, um, what makes a movement like the labor movement, for example, politically independent? What gives it independence? Is it just something that you sort of decide to declare in a manifesto one day, or how do you do it?
Yeah, in the discussions about political independence, who are the people who are politically independent? In the mainstream media, we usually only have discussions about this in relation to elections, right? It's about which party are people voting for? Are they Democrat or Republican, or neither? And usually that neither, if they're classified as an independent, that just means they get lumped into some middle, right? But I think this is a very narrow way of thinking about political independence. And what our movement, what the People's World does, is try to look at this idea of political independence separated from elections a bit, right? It's not just about which party you vote for or your choice to not vote for either one. Political independence, in our view, is something that happens all year round, every year, whether there's an election or not. And, Bennett talked about some of those movements just now, which are politically independent. The labor movement, Black Lives Matter, and the other movements of nationally and racially oppressed people, the LGBTQ movement, the women's movement. All of these are forces of political independence. They act on their own and in coalition with each other. During election time, that might also mean, participating in the campaigns to either elect candidates at the local, national level, or to try to block candidates from the right wing at the national or local level. So we have to think broader, I think, about political independence. It's an image of, we have to have an image of movements acting on their own issues, working together, whether or not that happens to be in conjunction with politicians who are running for office. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
Absolutely. And Anita, so thinking just kind of in terms of the theoretical perspective of Marxism, we identify as materialists. We look at the real conditions of production, what's really happening on the ground. We don't consider that society changes because of ideas that people have. So what does that mean when we think about political independence? What is a materialist take on it? What do we look for? Is it, again, kind of a similar question to what I asked CJ? Is it just a manifesto, or do we need what enables a movement to be politically independent?
I think it really depends on organization and getting people united behind a perspective, a vision of how to how we should be governed, how we should organize ourselves to meet human needs. I think that organization is really important, and that's why the trade union movement is so crucial here. I think one of the really significant examples of political independence was the United Auto Workers calling for a ceasefire at the same time, or in short order, they then endorsed Biden for re-election. It showed that they were willing to take a position that was really at odds with the Democratic Party, and yet they supported the Democratic Party and they took independent positions. And I think that's what's the most important here. And I think it means you have to have a committed group that is willing to act on their convictions. And I think the nature of work is something that contributes to political independence. I think the way workers are organized or not organized, the gig economy, a lot of developments in the working class have really had an effect on how we do politics in this country. So I think we may be seeing a greater upsurge of independent political action. I hope so.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head, and especially I loved your last formulation there, independent political action, as opposed to thinking of just a static like mass number of independent voters, thinking about who are the forces that are in action, organizing, and we think about that organization, building the infrastructure for it, labor organizing, for example, its own phone banks, or being able to run its own campaigns, and not just labor, obviously, this happens throughout the movement, but political independence. Lenin has this great formulation in Two Tactics where he says, it doesn't matter whether you declare your political independence from bourgeois politics, what determines whether you're actually independent is whether you can make your mark on the struggle, whether you can put your stamp on political events. He said, put the proletarian stamp on political events, and that's something I return to a lot. Thinking of how we make the working class a force, or build its independent political capacities. And in that context, you drew attention to the ceasefire struggle and the role that labor has played, which has been extraordinary in the context of recent U.S. history. The uncommitted movement has organized around a ceasefire and end of the occupation as well. Is that, Anita, also an example of political independence?
Absolutely. That was a really significant contribution to our politics this season. I think the movement of, it varied from state to state, but people were able to make a statement about the Biden administration and its support of the genocide in Gaza. And they did this through the uncommitted, voting for no candidate rather than voting for Biden in the primary. So I think it was meaningful. It really drew attention to that struggle. And I think it didn't, there was a vote against Biden in some states. It didn't really mean that. I think North Carolina was singled out, where they looked at where in North Carolina the uncommitted vote was, and it was in areas where there were a lot of Republicans who voted in the Democratic primary in North Carolina. So that was a different story. But of course, in Michigan, it was sincerely a protest vote against the Biden administration, and it really called attention to their policies in the Middle East, and made people look at those policies again and make some decisions about how to go forward. Hopefully, it will make a difference in how the Harris-Walz administration goes forward in that struggle.
Absolutely. And let's hope so, because thus far, you know, we have to see where the new administration will head. First of all, we have to make sure Trump doesn't get elected, because we remember what his Palestine policy was to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem and deny kind of any um, rights of the Palestinian people. But Bennett, did the uncommitted movement, did it work?
I think it depends on what we mean by did it work. I feel like I've seen a lot of reactions to the uncommitted movement and kind of its setbacks at the DNC, of being unable to get like a bare minimum demand of a Palestinian American speaker on the stage. I've seen a lot of dismissive, like "I told you so" attitude from some on the left, and I feel like this has been kind of um, a huge issue for us. I think that it's like we understand that both parties are capitalist parties. The Democratic and Republican parties are both capitalist parties, they're both imperialist parties. But we also have to remember that the majority of the population is still kind of wedded to the two-party system to some extent or another. Even those who don't vote, they're not typically voting for third parties or alternatives. Um, and so when we see these movements that express genuine democratic demands, from the movements, from the people, even when they experience setbacks, these are exactly the kinds of movements that create the basis for not just independent political action, but political independence from the two-party system in general, which as communists is something that we aspire to. And I feel like this kind of attitude is misguided. I think that in its own way, the uncommitted movement has exposed to a lot in the base of the Democratic Party the kind of nature of the Democratic Party, as and their policies, particularly in regards to Gaza. And so I think that there are moments of, even during the setbacks that we saw at the Democratic National Convention, we also saw a huge kind of media attention. A lot of people who were, lifelong Democrats, lifelong, Democratic Party um, activists, taking different stances to the administration. And that's something that we should be celebrating and supporting, and building that independent political action, in our movements. And that's so I think that in a sense, there are both setbacks but also important successes. And I think that that's what we have to pay attention to as Marxists, as communists, of looking kind of at the material progression of independent working class consciousness.
Thanks. And CJ, you were at the Democratic National Convention covering it for PW, as was our producer, Taryn. Um, and, we're talking, Bennett really, I think, sort of clearly identified that this is a fight for political independence. It's not a matter of whether it exists in its full form at the present moment. It's an ongoing struggle. Based on what you saw at the DNC, how's that um, how's that struggle progressing?
Yeah, I think we can draw together the threads of what everybody's been saying. A few minutes ago, you mentioned how Lenin had written, you're making an impact when you can see your stamp upon the events of the day. The stamp of the movements. And if we look at Kamala Harris's speech on the last night of the DNC, and that recognition that was given to the right of the Palestinian people's their right to national self-determination. That was sort of a stamp, I would argue. That was a stamp of what had been happening that whole week at the Democratic National Convention.
Looks like
Yeah?
CJ may be experiencing some technical difficulties here.
No, we can.
Am I okay to speak then?
You're good, CJ.
Okay.
I think it might be Scott.
I think Scott might have the difficulties.
He'll be back.
Okay, so what I was saying is that recognition in Harris's speech was in a lot of ways symbolic of the political debates and fights and struggles that were going on all week long at the DNC in Chicago. Because when you watch the convention at home on your television set, all you see is the rah-rah speeches at night, right? Mostly elected officials from the party, a few movement leaders sprinkled in here and there. But during the day at the Democratic National Convention, the scenes that don't end up on television, that's where a lot of the movements, that's where the political independence is having its impact, right? So, for instance, there was the first ever panel on Palestine at a Democratic convention. That was the result of organizing by the Arab American Institute, by the Uncommitted movement, and by several others. And all week long, on the periphery of the DNC, there were events going on related to the fight against the war in Gaza. For instance, the Rainbow Push Coalition, together with the Arab American Institute and Progressives for a Ceasefire, there were 3 days of events specifically devoted to putting this issue in the spotlight. There were the street protests, which we covered, and Taryn and Cameron Harrison, our reporters, were embedded at a lot of those demonstrations as well. There was the sit-in protest by uncommitted delegates themselves who were demanding to get a Palestinian speaker on stage. As Bennett said, that demand wasn't met. But if you look at what happened throughout the course of the week, I think there were a lot of wins for the ceasefire movement. Did it succeed in changing U.S. foreign policy? No, not yet. And there were a lot of disappointing parts in that same speech that I mentioned by Harris when it comes to the war machine and NATO and imperialism. But those movements were having an impact, and I think if we look at some of the independent media coverage, and People's World was a part of that, some of the independent media coverage of what happened during the DNC, we can see that political independence was really happening during that convention, and it wasn't just the cheering crowds that you saw on television.
Thank you. I think that's a very useful way of talking about political independence, right? To think about what issues are on the table and what issues are off the table, and building that organized power to determine what those are. To put the issue of Palestinian national liberation and to put the issue of, there's some fundamental working class issues about the cost of living as well that were sort of forced onto the table because of changes in the mass movements. We'll turn now, I think, to France for our final segment, where we've seen both a huge growth of the movement for the political independence of the working class in particular, but also some significant setbacks. So earlier this summer, in snap parliamentary elections, a left-wing coalition won the largest number of seats in the National Assembly. And it's been a long time since the left has been the biggest bloc in the National Assembly. So normally that would put them in the position of recommending someone for prime minister that the president would then appoint. However, Emmanuel Macron, the current president, refuses to appoint the prime minister recommended by that left-wing coalition on grounds that there wouldn't be enough agreement in the National Assembly. CJ, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah, so just to kind of catch people up, these snap elections happened after the far right, the neo-Nazi party, the National Rally, had a runaway success in the European Parliament elections. And so Macron called these snap parliamentary elections, expecting, I think, that he could benefit from, the people being afraid that the fascists were gaining all this power and they would come running to his party, the centrist party. But that didn't happen. Instead, the majority, not the majority, but the largest number of people who voted saw the left coalition, the New Popular Front, which was an alliance of the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, the France Unbowed movement, and the Greens. They saw that as the best way to beat back the fascists. And so, as you mentioned, that should give that coalition, the New Popular Front, the right to form government. But as we've seen ever since those elections almost 2 months ago, Macron has come up with one excuse after another to avoid appointing the left's choice as prime minister. first he said, oh, well, we have to survey the results. So I'll leave the current prime minister in power for a while temporarily. Then he used the Olympics as an excuse. Oh, this is a time for national unity, not political division. Well, the Olympics are pretty much over. And what we saw was it was kind of an attempt to run out the clock. He was hoping that the left would become disunified and that therefore he could keep his party's hold on power in the parliament. But the left has stayed united. They have their candidate. So now what we have seen is Macron has actually resorted to aligning with the National Rally, with the fascist party. He came and said, we've had consultations, and if I appoint a new Popular Front government, they will immediately have no support in Parliament because at least 350 MPs will vote against them. Okay, that if you do the math, the only way you can get to 350 is if you add Macron's MPs with the National Rally and a smaller conservative group. So even though he's not openly admitting it, he has put his party in alliance with the fascist party. Now, why is this happening? Well, backing Macron has been the most powerful elements of big business in France. They are more scared of what a left-wing government will do, which is things like raise taxes, lower the retirement age, and start actually spending on social services again. They're more afraid of that than they are of this other party with its roots in the neo-Nazi movement. So there is a moment of political crisis in France, and the leaders of the New Popular Front are calling for an all-out mobilization of the people, because what they see happening is essentially a coup from the top by the president himself.
Thank you. And that really, it sort of throws light on the importance of the political independence of the working class. We in Marxism, we consider the working class to have a special role in social change, in political progress, because of its role within capitalist production. And we see, as you mentioned, the terror of big business at the idea of a left-wing government. Anita, what are some of the lessons that we could draw here? As we think about when we think about the political independence of the working class in particular, where does it end? What's the
Well, hopefully it doesn't end. I think one thing I've been thinking about throughout this conversation that we really haven't talked about is how we tend to focus when we talk about elections on the issues. And I think when you look at the issues that are really important to people and to people's lives, you can see where political independence might emerge. For instance, the struggle for reproductive rights. I think that is an issue, obviously that's been a big issue since June of 22 when Dobbs' decision came down. But in I keep going back to Ohio, but in Ohio, that constituency, the pro reproductive rights, was really drew on a lot of different smaller constituencies within the working class, and emerged victorious with our issue 1 and issue 1 legislation or votes last year that put voting reproductive rights in the state constitution. So I think the future of independent movements is movements around specific issues. People who are fighting global climate crisis, and really focused on that can serve as an independent force, independent of the political parties. And I'm glad to hear from CJ that these kind of groups were very active in the DNC on the daytime anyway. And it reminds me of some of the political formations that they have in Cuba, for example, where individual groups are represented, women's organizations, particular industry labor organizations, just a lot of different constituencies all contribute to the political decisions of how it's going to be organized going forward, what the new constitution was going to look like, what was the family code going to look like. So I think focusing on issue-related organizations might be one place to find and cultivate political independence.
Absolutely. And I really like the way you sort of put elections in their place. Like they have a role, a very definite one. But where the action is, where the movement is all year round, every year, not just in election season, organizing on the issues. And what happens in the elections comes out of that and also influences it, right? So that those issue-based campaigns and issue-based coalitions are absolutely key to going back to what CJ said, to decide what issues are on the table when it does come to election time. And I guess I'll end with a final question for Bennett. The Communist Party is a political party, right? When are we going to start running candidates, or start running more of them?
As soon as possible. I mean, I think that in places like DC, this is a real kind of question that we're looking at advancing, in the movement, because there are lots of places, particularly in very progressive areas like DC, where there's like a unique kind of opportunity to run third party candidates in a viable sense. And I think that that's kind of where we really need to focus our political energies as a political party on making sure that we are setting out to build campaigns that we can win, to gain that power, as a working class party, as a communist party. I mean, you know I feel like these are super important issues. We have a large base of people in the, two-party system who are realizing that this system doesn't represent the working class. It doesn't represent the full interests of the working class. Because these are capitalist, imperialist parties. And so I think that we have a real opportunity in this moment to kind of use the communities and the influence that we have within our communities to really push for getting that alternative voice into politics, and particularly into local politics, because that's what the far right has been doing. Moms for Liberty, for example, will come in and take over school boards, and these are really key terrains for battle, and they have more power than people tend to realize. And I think that these are places where we can really exercise, our independence as the Communist Party, and really get like a real working class representative with it in governance.
Thanks. And yeah, and when we think about the working class, just a reminder, you know, we see the working class not in the narrow sense that's sometimes used in the bourgeois press, but in the very broad Marxist sense that everybody who has to sell their labor power to put food on the table. Our working class is multiracial and multinational. It's men, women, people of all genders, people of all ages, and we are in this long struggle, right, to build the political independence of our class to the point where it can be the class that holds power in society, to contest with the capitalist class for control of society and the economy. And that's socialism, the culmination of the political independence and political leadership of the working class. So thanks for joining us. Again, happy Labor Day, and keep up the fight.
Thanks, Scott. Bye.
Later, comrades.